This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. As we turn now to a story that reveals the real source behind the Bush administration's decision to raise the terror alert level to orange 6 years ago. It was December 2003. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge warned of, quote, near-term attacks that could either rival or exceed what we experienced on September 11th. He claimed the information came from credible sources. But a new report in the latest issue of Playboy magazine by investigative journalist Aram Roston shows that the source was a man who convinced the Bush White House, the CIA, the Navy, Special Forces Command, the Air Force, and the Senate Intelligence Committee that the TV network Al Jazeera was transmitting secret messages to al-Qaeda sleepers. Dennis Montgomery operated a small software company out of Nevada. He said he could predict terrorist attacks by decrypting secret barcodes hidden in Al Jazeera's broadcast. The Bush administration relied on Montgomery for years to determine when to increase the terror threat level. Well, I recently interviewed journalist Aram Roston, author of The Man Who Pushed America to War, The Extraordinary Life, Adventures, and Obsessions of Ahmed Chalabi. His article is called The Man Who Conned the Pentagon. I began by asking him just to explain the story.
It was one of the most bizarre intelligence operations I've ever heard of. A man who was not necessarily a scientist, but he was a self-proclaimed scientist and a self-proclaimed inventor. He claimed he'd found these secret messages. He claimed he decoded al-Qaeda's secret communications to sleeper terrorists around the world. And he was doing this in this warehouse in Nevada on his computer. People in the administration took him seriously, and people in the intelligence services took him seriously. Not everybody. Some people thought this was complete nonsense, because it was. But enough people took him seriously that it had immense effects on people across the world and in America.
Well, first of all, let's go to that moment when the terror alert was raised. It was almost exactly 6 years ago, right? December 21st, 2003, raised to orange. Why?
This fellow, Dennis Montgomery.
And who is he?
He is a self-proclaimed scientist. He doesn't have much of a scientific education. He had a 2-year degree in medical technology, and he was an inventor and a self-proclaimed computer programmer. I don't know how much skills he has as a software programmer, but he said that in Al Jazeera he was finding these hidden numbers shaped as barcodes.
Who was he telling this to?
He had access to the intelligence services, to a division within the CIA called Science and Technology, and he had that through political contacts that his financier had.
And his financier was?
His financier was a former aide of the former right-hand man to Michael Milken, the disgraced junk bond king of all things.
From many years ago.
Yeah.
He went to prison.
Michael Milken went to prison. Now, the fellow who was financing Dennis Montgomery, Warren Trepp, he never went to prison. This SEC went after him, but never successfully.
And how did he get these contracts, and what exactly did he say? I mean, explain what you're saying, because, I mean, this is not just the crazy fantasizing of one guy. You have Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, talking about, you know, Al Jazeera being a terrorist network.
That's very true. So people saw Al Jazeera in this light, this negative light. The administration did already, perhaps. But what he was saying is it had no idea. No, it didn't matter what the content was. He was saying in the electronic feed from Al Jazeera, there was little secret bits of information injected in it technologically, just little bits and so forth. Perhaps the pixels were rearranged, and he was able to decode it all. He was able to decode it all and translate it into numbers. Those numbers, he said, were latitudes and longitudes. In other words, it was a stream of video, and he was finding these latitudes and longitudes, times, flight numbers, and he would just churn that out. He would call it, this is my output. This is the Al Jazeera output. And he had figured out a way that somehow Al Jazeera was al-Qaeda's method of transmitting this data secretly. What it would have required, of course, is all these terrorists around the world to have some sort of decoding equipment that could have unscrambled it, which was...
And these longitudes and latitudes were supposedly of attacks?
Yeah. Sometimes it wasn't even a latitude and longitude. Sometimes it was just the latitude. It's just one number. And he was like, it's somewhere around here, and he would just work and say, it's here. And then, you know, you'd have scares like Tappahannock, Virginia was one place, a little town in Virginia, or you know, somewhere in Seattle, or Galveston, Texas, near the fuel tanks, and they would react.
And they would cancel planes, for example, around the holidays, like the French airlines, Air France.
Exactly. That was one particular period when they took him, for some reason, he was taken very seriously. It was during that orange alert, and he was the source for all those numbers that were, those flights that were, he was the reason those flights were canceled. Most people in the administration didn't even know where it was coming from. Only a tiny group knew of Dennis Montgomery, a very tiny group, perhaps a handful of people at the CIA. A slightly bigger group knew about this crazy Al Jazeera bit. They knew the substance of what he was saying. But that part got to the Bush White House, it got to the Homeland Security, and it made its way to the administration. And by the way, it's all still classified. Even though they all know it's false, it's still classified.